Walk through the gates of St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, and the first surprise is that it does not feel like a field of graves. It feels like a city. There are narrow streets, intersections, walls, addresses, family names, grand facades, crowded neighborhoods, and small buildings standing shoulder to shoulder. Some resemble chapels, others look like miniature townhouses. Behind their sealed doors are not rooms, but generations of the same family. New Orleans did not merely bury its dead above ground, it gave them architecture. The popular explanation is that the city's water table pushed coffins out of the earth. That sometimes happened, but it is only part of the story. The real answer begins with French and Spanish Catholic traditions, then passes through swampy soil, limited land, yellow fever epidemics, social ambition, and a burial system that learned to reuse the same tomb for generations. These cemeteries became known as cities of the dead. But like the city outside their walls, they were never equal. The wealthy received marble monuments on prominent avenues. Workers pooled their money for society vaults. The poorest and many enslaved and black New Orleanians were buried in marginal ground that later vanished almost entirely. To understand why New Orleans buried people above ground, we have to read this stone city as we would any other neighborhood. We have to ask who owned the buildings, who built them, and whose names are missing from the streets. Chapter 1. Read the street. Begin with the path beneath your feet in St. Louis. Number 1, the lanes are tight because the cemetery was never designed as an open lawn. Tombs line the passages the way houses line a block. Their fronts face the path. Surnames occupy the place where an address might be. Iron gates mark private boundaries. Cornices, pediments, columns, crosses, urns, and carved angels announce taste and belief. The resemblance to a city is more than poetic. These are buildings. Most began with a brick core, covered in lime plaster or stucco to protect the masonry from rain and heat. Families with money added marble tablets, granite, cast iron fences, statuary, or architectural styles borrowed from the living city. A modest tomb might be a plain white box. A wealthy family's monument could resemble a chapel, a Greek temple, or a miniature palace. The cemetery even has different kinds of housing. There are freestanding family tombs built to hold generations. There are long walls of stacked burial niches, commonly called oven vaults because their arched openings resemble old ovens. There are large society tombs with rows of compartments belonging not to one bloodline, but to an association of workers, immigrants, or neighbors. And beyond the most photographed avenues were simpler graves and common burial grounds for people who could not buy architecture at all. The city outside was divided into commercial streets, grand avenues, working neighborhoods, and marginal ground. The cemetery repeated that social map in stone. But this stone city did not appear all at once. Before New Orleans raised tombs above the ground, it tried burying people much as other American cities did. That first cemetery has disappeared so completely that thousands now pass over its former world without seeing a single marker. Chapter 2. The Cemetery That Vanished. In the early 18th century, New Orleans buried many of its dead in and around a cemetery on St. Peter Street, inside what is now the French Quarter. The burials were largely in the ground. The graves were practical, inexpensive, and familiar. They were also placed in a city barely separated from the water around it. Dig into New Orleans soil and the earth can answer with water. Early descriptions tell of grave pits filling as they were opened. Heavy rain saturated the ground. Coffins could become waterlogged, shift, or rise when floodwater and pressure disturbed shallow burial places. The familiar story about floating coffins was not invented from nothing. But the old cemetery had another problem. It was trapped inside a growing town. Death came quickly in colonial New Orleans. Disease, heat, Poor sanitation, accidents, childbirth, and the dangers of the river produced a steady need for burial space. A cemetery that had once stood near the edge of settlement found itself surrounded by streets and houses. By the late 18th century, officials wanted burial moved beyond the city's fortifications. St. Louis. Cemetery No. 1 was established in 1789 on land that was then outside the main settled area. At first, the new ground still received burials below the surface. Yet, during the Spanish colonial period, another model was already entering the city: the wall vault and masonry tomb familiar in Catholic parts of Spain, France, Italy, and the Caribbean. The earliest above-ground tombs at St. Louis No. 1 appeared around the beginning of the 19th century. By the 1810s, they were becoming a recognizable part of the cemetery. They solved local problems, but they also carried prestige. A tomb linked a New Orleans family to an older Catholic world across the Atlantic and Caribbean. It made burial visible, durable, and architectural. The old St. Peter Street Cemetery eventually vanished beneath the living city. St. Louis. No. 1 remained. Its survival makes the transition look inevitable. It was not. Above-ground burial became dominant because several pressures, water, faith, fashion, crowding, and fear, began reinforcing one another. And one later cemetery would expose the weakness in the simplest explanation of all. Chapter 3. The Water Table Myth. If water alone created the cities of the dead, every New Orleans burial would have needed to rise above the ground. That is not what happened. Some New Orleans cemeteries contain in-ground graves. Jewish burial grounds traditionally followed different religious customs and often retained ground burial even in the same difficult landscape. More revealing still is Metairie Cemetery, opened in 1872 on relatively high ground along Metairie Ridge. Its sweeping avenues follow the oval of a former racetrack. The land offered better drainage than the oldest low-lying cemeteries, yet wealthy families continued building elaborate above-ground tombs and mausoleums there. By then, the tomb was no longer merely an answer to wet soil. It had become the language of respectable New Orleans burial. That does not make the water table irrelevant. A grave filling with water is a real physical problem. Floods and saturated soil could damage coffins and disturb burials. Brick vaults raised remains away from the most unstable ground, and masonry gave families something they could inspect, repair, and revisit. But practical adaptation does not explain why tombs acquired pediments, angels, columns, imported marble, and family names large enough to read across an avenue. Culture explains that transformation. French and Spanish Catholic traditions offered a familiar model of family vaults and wall burials. Catholic practice placed value on consecrated ground, respectful treatment of remains, and continuity between generations. The city's Caribbean connections reinforced forms that already made sense in hot colonial ports. New Orleans then turned these precedents into a local system. The result was self-reinforcing. Once prominent families built tombs, other families wanted them. Once masons, plasterers, marble cutters, architects, sextons, and undertakers specialized in them, tomb construction became a local industry. Once cemeteries were laid out around vaults, anyone hoping to remain with relatives in an old burial ground had reason to use the same form. So the honest answer is less dramatic than the legend, but more interesting. New Orleans did not raise all its dead because coffins simply refused to stay buried. Wet ground helped make tombs useful, Catholic tradition made them meaningful, social ambition made them desirable, and repeated catastrophe made the entire system necessary. Chapter 4. When fever filled the city. In the 19th century, summer could change the sound of New Orleans. Doors closed. Businesses slowed. Church bells marked another death. Carts carried bodies towards cemeteries already crowded with recent burials. Residents blamed heat, foul air, stagnant canals, strangers, cargo, and the smell of decay. They did not yet understand that yellow fever was carried by mosquitoes. What they did understand was volume. Yellow fever returned again and again, but the epidemic of 1853 was catastrophic. In one season, roughly 8,000 people died in New Orleans. Many were immigrants with little protection from the disease and few established family networks in the city. Burial registers reduced the emergency to lines of names, ages, birthplaces, causes of death, and destinations. Page after page turned private grief into municipal arithmetic. The crisis did not invent above-ground burial, but it intensified the logic behind it. City policy had already pushed new burial grounds farther from the dense center, reflecting fears about sanitation and the supposed vapors of the dead. Existing cemeteries could continue receiving interments through masonry tombs and vaults. Sealed structures looked controlled in a city terrified of what might be escaping from wet earth. They were also efficient. A family tomb could serve more than one generation without requiring a new plot each time. Long walls of vaults created many burial spaces on a narrow footprint. Society tombs allowed an organization to house dozens or hundreds of members behind a single facade. Stand before one of those long walls and the architecture begins to look like emergency planning. Repetition allowed speed. A tablet could be removed, a coffin placed inside, the opening bricked and sealed, the name restored to the front. During a season when death moved faster than the city could mourn, the cemetery had developed a way to absorb it. But a tomb that held generations required one procedure visitors often misunderstand. The family did not keep adding full coffins forever. The building had to make space, and the method turned the tomb into something between a grave, an oven, and an archive. Chapter 5. The house that reused its rooms. Look closely at a family tomb and imagine its front opened. Behind the marble tablet is a masonry chamber large enough for a coffin. Beneath or behind that chamber may be a lower space known as the caveau. New Orleans developed a well-documented custom often described as a year and a day. It was a practice, not a universal law applied identically to every cemetery and every tomb. The principle was that a vault should remain sealed long enough for decomposition to advance before it was reopened for another burial. The climate helped. Sun heated the masonry. The sealed vault became intensely hot, accelerating processes that would occur more slowly underground. When the next family burial came after sufficient time, a sexton or tomb worker removed the tablet and brick closure. The earlier remains were gathered carefully, often placed in a bag or container, and moved into the caveau. The new coffin entered the main chamber. The opening was sealed again. Nothing had been discarded. The previous generation remained inside the family tomb, joined eventually by the next. This is what made a modest structure capable of holding a lineage. Its capacity was not measured only in coffins. It was measured in time. A tomb could be reopened, rearranged, repaired, and used again. The surname on the facade stayed constant while the people behind it accumulated. The procedure sounds unsettling because modern Americans often imagine a grave as an untouched private space. New Orleans treated the family tomb differently. It was closer to a permanent household for the dead. The building stayed, its interior changed. Families returned to whitewash the plaster, reset tablets, clear vegetation, and add names. On commemorative days, maintenance became an act of kinship. The system also exposed another inequality. A family needed legal access to a tomb, someone who remembered the claim, and money for masonry work. When descendants moved away, organizations dissolved or maintenance stopped, the supposed permanence of stone began to fail. Stucco cracked. Bricks absorbed water. Tablets loosened. Roots opened seams. A tomb built to defeat decay could itself be abandoned. And if a family could not afford a tomb in the first place, New Orleans offered other kinds of addresses, each revealing exactly where that family stood in the social city. Chapter 6. The Neighborhoods of the Dead. On the most prominent cemetery avenues, wealth announced itself as architecture. Elite families commissioned freestanding tombs with marble facades, sculpture, ironwork, and designs from well-known architects. At Cemeteries, the former racetrack became a garden of monuments where industrialists, politicians, soldiers, and old families built memorials intended to outlast the houses they had occupied in life. For working people, the solution was often collective. Mutual aid and benevolent societies collected regular dues from members. In return, a society could provide assistance during sickness, support for widows and children, a funeral procession, and the right to a place in a communal tomb. French, German, Italian, Irish, Chinese, Black, and occupational associations built large vaults with rows of burial niches. The facade carried the organization's name. Membership created a form of dignity that private wealth could not. These structures were social insurance made visible. A laborer who could never commission a marble family chapel might still avoid an anonymous grave because fellow members had purchased a permanent wall together. In Lafayette Cemetery No. 2, African-American benevolent and labor organizations built imposing society vaults associated with groups of coachmen, tradesmen, and yard workers. Excluded from many institutions of the living city, they constructed institutions for sickness, death, and family survival. Below that level were oven vaults and rented wall niches. They made masonry burial possible without ownership of a freestanding tomb. Their repeated openings created an architecture of economy, one slot above another, one name replacing another, every inch of the wall made useful. But rented space was less secure. Rights depended on payment, records, and the authority controlling the cemetery. And then there were the common graves and potter's fields. Here the city analogy becomes uncomfortable. A city preserves its mansions and often demolishes its poorest quarters. New Orleans did something similar with the dead. The elaborate tombs remained legible because stone carried surnames forward. Wood markers decayed. Shallow graves subsided. Common burial grounds were closed, reused, built over, or forgotten. The cemetery did not erase class. It made class visible from the path. Yet class alone cannot explain whose monuments disappeared. To understand the missing addresses, the history of slavery must be named clearly, and separately from the later histories of paid labor, free black craftsmanship, and mutual aid. Chapter 7. The People Missing from the Walls. Enslaved people were not servants participating in the same economic system as dues-paying society members or hired cemetery workers. They were human beings held as property. Their labor built and maintained the living city, and enslaved craftspeople also contributed to its bricks, masonry, lime, plaster, transport, and construction. But formal burial architecture was rarely offered to them on equal terms. Records from Lafayette Cemetery No. 1 indicate that enslaved people accounted for a substantial share of burials in its early decades, about 3 in 10 entries in one studied period between 1833 and 1853. Yet their exact resting places are largely unknown. The records can confirm that they entered the cemetery without telling us where the cemetery placed them. That absence is evidence. An ornate tomb can preserve a family name for 2 centuries. A simple grave in low ground may leave nothing once its marker rots and the soil changes. If enslaved people were buried in peripheral plots or unmarked earth, the cemetery's surviving architecture would gradually produce a false picture, a city crowded with the names of owners, merchants, officials, and established families, but strangely empty of the people whose labor sustained them. After emancipation, Black New Orleanians continued to face unequal access to land, money, institutions, and burial space. Yet they did not enter the story only as victims of exclusion. Black benevolent societies created funeral systems of their own. Members paid dues, cared for the sick, supported bereaved families, organized processions, and built society tombs. A communal vault could say that a group of workers who were denied security elsewhere would not allow its members to disappear anonymously. Holt Cemetery, established in the late 19th century for indigent burials, offers a very different landscape from St. Louis No. 1 or Cemeteries. Many of its dead are Black New Orleanians. The graves are largely in the ground, marked with handmade crosses, concrete, wood, shells, photographs, plastic, flowers, and objects placed by families. It may look less architectural to a tourist, but it contains another kind of city, one built through repeated acts of care rather than marble permanence. Other burial grounds for the poor vanished more completely. At Locust Grove, former Potter's Field land was eventually repurposed. The city moved on above ground while the people below lost even the outline of a neighborhood. This is the dark ledger behind the beauty. The cities of the dead preserve extraordinary amounts of history, but preservation is selective. Stone remembers those who could obtain it. The ground keeps many of the rest without a name. Chapter 8. Who Built the City of the Dead? A cemetery made of buildings requires builders. Brick had to be formed and fired. Lime had to be burned and mixed. Foundations had to be adapted to soil that moved and settled. Walls had to be kept plumb. Stucco had to shed rain while allowing old masonry to breathe. Marble tablets had to be lettered, transported, and fixed in place. Every graceful facade depended on work that was dusty, hot, heavy, and continuous. In the antebellum period, that workforce included both enslaved and free black laborers and craftspeople. Free people of color occupied important positions in New Orleans' building trades. Flourville Foy, a free man of color and marble cutter, executed tomb work associated with the architect Jacques-Nicolas Bussière de Pouilly, whose designs helped give 19th-century New Orleans cemeteries their distinctive neoclassical and Gothic forms. Later, Italian and Sicilian stonecutters brought additional carving traditions to the city. Immigrant associations turned their society tombs into declarations of arrival and belonging. At Cypress Grove, the Songantong Association built an east-facing Chinese society tomb with space for ritual offerings. It was designed in connection with a tradition in which remains might be held temporarily before returning to ancestral ground. One stone city could therefore contain radically different ideas of permanence. The work did not end when construction ended. Tombs are not sealed monuments outside nature. New Orleans heat expands materials, rain enters cracks, hurricanes drive water across surfaces, the soil subsides, iron rusts and swells against masonry, plants take root in joints, vandals break tablets or breach openings. Families and cemetery workers must patch plaster, reset brick, repaint, reletter, clean, and close what the climate has opened. On All Saints' Day, families traditionally return to care for tombs and remember their dead. Whitewashing was not merely cosmetic, it renewed the protective skin of the building. Maintenance made memory visible. When a family line ended or a benevolent society dissolved, that labor often ended too. A grand tomb with wealthy descendants might be restored. A working-class society vault with no surviving organization could remain open to weather. The cemetery's present condition therefore records not only old wealth, but continuing access to money and attention. By the 20th century, the romantic City of the Dead had acquired a harsher companion phrase, the slums of the dead. The difference between the two was often not architecture at birth, but maintenance after memory weakened. Chapter 9. from sacred ground to attraction. Today, St. Louis number 1 is both an active burial place and one of the most famous tourist landscapes in New Orleans. Visitors arrive looking for white tombs, weathered angels, stories of yellow fever, and the reputed resting place of Marie Laveau. The cemetery is photographed as Gothic scenery, a ready-made stage for mystery. But the people moving through it are not all spectators. Some are descendants, some have relatives inside the walls. A passage that looks picturesque to a visitor may be the route to a family tomb still opened for new burials. Tourism supplies attention and money, but it can also convert mourning into entertainment. Tombs have been marked, painted, chipped, entered, and damaged. The Laveau-Glapion tomb, widely believed to hold Marie Laveau though competing claims remain, became a focus for ritual markings and vandalism. Access to St. Louis number 1 was eventually restricted to family members and visitors accompanied by registered guides. The rule changed the experience at the gate, but it exposed a larger question: who is the cemetery for? If it is treated only as a tourist attraction, the dead become scenery. If it is treated only as private sacred ground, the public loses access to an extraordinary historical archive. Preservation groups, church authorities, city officials, craftspeople, scholars, tour companies, and families all approach the same walls with different responsibilities, and resources are limited. A famous marble tomb is easy to place on a fundraising brochure. A cracked society vault belonging to a vanished labor organization may tell a more revealing story, but it has fewer living advocates. A potter's field with no grand facade may contain thousands of lives and receive almost no architectural attention. The modern preservation debate therefore repeats the cemetery's oldest hierarchy. Which streets are repaired first? Which names are researched? Which tombs are stabilized? Which common grounds are mapped? Which missing people are restored to the story even when their markers cannot be restored? New Orleans has dozens of historic cemeteries and many remain active. Above-ground burial continues in family and communal vaults. The city has also adopted cremation, lawn burial, modern mausoleums, and other forms. Yet the old tombs remain its most powerful image of death because they make memory physical. They also make forgetting physical. Ending. Who received an address returned to the narrow lane in St. Louis number 1. The walls are bright in the sun. Stucco flakes from old brick. Names appear in marble, fade, and reappear on newer tablets. A family tomb that looks like a single grave may contain generations. A society vault may hold the history of an occupation, an immigrant community, or a network of Black mutual aid. Beneath another part of the cemetery, people recorded in burial books may rest without a surviving sign above them. Now the phrase, "City of the Dead," means something different. The cemetery looks like a city because it was built through the same human forces that built New Orleans itself: faith, water, disease, migration, craftsmanship, family ambition, collective care, racial power, and unequal access to land. The dead were raised above ground partly because the ground was wet and unstable. But water alone cannot explain these streets. It cannot explain why tombs copied chapels and townhouses. It cannot explain why families reused them for generations. It cannot explain why workers purchased communal walls, why wealthy families chose monuments even on higher ground, or why some communities remained almost invisible. New Orleans buried people above ground because a practical response became a cultural tradition, and the tradition became a social expectation. Catholic vault customs gave the city a model. The landscape made that model useful. Epidemics made efficiency urgent. Masons and marble cutters made it beautiful. Families and societies made it permanent, or tried to. Because no architecture guarantees memory, a tomb survives only while someone maintains it, protects it, records it, and believes the person inside still belongs to the city's story. That is the final contradiction of New Orleans burial. The tomb was designed to keep generations together, yet the cemetery still separated people by wealth and power. Some families received marble addresses on prominent avenues. Some workers built shared houses for their dead. Others entered common ground that the living city later erased. So when we walk these stone streets, the most important question is not simply why the tombs stand above ground. It is who was allowed to stand above ground with them. The cities of the dead are not strange because they resemble New Orleans. They are haunting because they resemble it so completely.